With True Detective returning to our screens with Season 4, it got me in a real mood for Season 1, so much so that I've just got off the back of rewatching it. Season 1 of True Detective is genuinely one of the best detective dramas that's ever been made. One of the main things that made Season 1 so interesting was the character Rust Cohle, a detective who was incredibly good at his job, but he had his own personal demons inside of him that had been plaguing his mind for years, and continued to as we saw him become somebody else in the future. So I thought I'd take a deep dive into the extremely well written character and analyse why he's like the way that he is. So let's get into it. Here is the curious case of Rust Cohle. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The transformation of Rust. Throughout the first season of True Detective, Rust underwent several transformations over the course of the 8 episodes. We witnessed him when he was put on the case of Dora Lang, where we saw that he was a slightly reserved person that had suffered through the trauma of losing a child and could say was dealt a bad hand in life. We then saw him 17 years later, where that same case had consumed him and he felt he owed a debt, and that was to not stop working until he solved it and found the person with the scars. And we also saw him in the final moments of the season, where he went from having a negative outlook on life into a positive one. Something that I don't think any of us would have predicted happening when we first started watching the show. This transformation was something which was vital for the development of not only the show, but also the character. Why? Because it gave us a real insight inside of the mind of Rust. It made him feel human. We could sympathize and empathize with him, and we got to see what he truly cared about: justice. He seemed to be the only detective on the force that felt like they wanted true justice, so it made him an anomaly. Rust was a character that felt like he was on the edge for the most part, in the sense that his life felt like it was full of so much darkness due to the death of his daughter, the divorce from his wife, and the things that he had to do, to the point where there was no room for light to enter. And that darkness even managed to make its way into the picture due to the line of work that he was in. Living in a house where he only used one room and slept on a mattress on the floor because he was closer to the work that he was doing that way. He had nothing in his life other than work, and that was the main thing that was present for the 17 years that we saw him. How does a man go from saying that death created time to grow the things that it would kill, and that being the sole reason for existing, to then saying, well, once there was only dark. If you ask me, the light's winning. Something which was completely different and framed his outlook on life in a more positive way. Well, despite living in a world of darkness for nearly 2 decades, it took him actually being on the cusp of death and giving up and being willing to die for him to return and look at the world in a more positive way. This was after feeling love for the first time in his life since the death of his daughter. When Rust was in his coma, he was just this vague awareness in the dark, and beneath that darkness there was a deeper, warm substance, and Rust could feel. He knew that his daughter waited for him there. He could feel her, and he could feel a piece of his father as well. He was a part of all things that he'd ever loved in that moment, and all he had to do was let go, and he did. He disappeared and he could still feel his daughter's love there, even more than before. But then he woke up. He realized whilst in hospital that the story of the world was light versus dark, and earlier on in the season he would have said that the world was just full of darkness and that it was winning. However, he now viewed the world as the light winning. The love that he felt was something that made him accept his daughter's death. The haunting loss that sat in his mind for nearly 2 decades wasn't going to plague it in a way that it once did, allowing him to look at the world in a more positive way. Despite us seeing Rust at 3 different points in his life where his descent into darkness only went deeper and deeper until the final moments where it changed, I would probably say that Rust felt more trapped when we were first introduced to him compared to how he was in the middle form when he was looking to solve the case. For example, the time where Rust went for dinner around Marty's, he was a complete mess. He was mourning his daughter and he was intoxicated. Whereas when he was sitting around the table, we saw that Maggie actually spoke to him and asked him a question about himself and just engaged in conversation. And from there we saw him open up, to the point where it went from him not wanting to stay to choosing to sit around the table and enjoying food with them, showing that he was completely alone in his life up until that point. Rust's transformation was easily one of the best things about season 1 of the show. Whilst Marty changed and turned into a better man with time, Rust did it in a less conventional way. Rust became the darkness, entered the darkness, and it was whilst in there with nothing around that he found the light and became a different person at the end. Rust's relationship with Marty. Rust's relationship with Marty was something that I found extremely interesting in the show, and it's a reason that this first season was so good. This is because the partnership that they had was infectious to watch. It was almost like a love-hate relationship. Marty was a Christian and believed in God. However, despite believing in religion, he didn't act how one should who follows the Bible. Whereas Rust believed that existence was pretty pointless and that it was a mistake and a misstep in evolution that humans evolved as far as they did. And he thought that everybody should essentially agree to stop procreating so the Earth could go back to its thriving self. However, even with that belief, Rust was actually a better man than what Marty was when it came to how he treated other people. People that he should have cared about. For the most part, there was this tension that was there between the pair. They didn't like each other, but they also didn't not like each other. They just had conflicting views and approaches for the most part. This was up until Marty found out that Maggie slept with Rust, which caused the both of them to have a bust up in the parking lot, for Rust to leave and then to not speak to Marty for 10 years. Rust was the better detective than Marty, and without Rust, Marty wouldn't have had the success that he went on to have, and I feel they both knew that. However, I would say that Marty was the only person that Rust had in his life that he could consider a friend. They didn't have the traditional friendship, but there were moments that I felt where even though Rust was going in aggressive, he was doing it because he was looking out for Marty and he cared about him. Take Marty cheating on his wife Maggie. Rust mentioned it to him in the locker room and Marty responded with aggression and told him to stay out of his business. But then, on another occasion, Rust returned Marty's mower and mowed his front lawn and was sharing a drink with Maggie. Whilst it was never explicitly explained if this was done as a way of getting into Marty's head, I think Rust did this as a way of making Marty aware of the feeling of jealousy and what it would be like for your partner to be with somebody else. Rust mowing his lawn was him stepping in on his property and doing something that wasn't his. And even though the encounter concluded with Marty being annoyed, I think Rust did this as a way of looking out for him, whilst making him aware of what it would feel like to be cheated on. So he just wanted to open his eyes. Whilst in their younger years, we saw the pair were quite different and had conflict between them. It was in their 2012 timeline where we saw just how similar the pair actually were, as their lives had unfolded to a point where they were almost living in parallel. With their connection of the Yellow King cult and the understanding that there was this one person out there that was never caught, and the fact that the killing of Marie Fontenot was videotaped, Rust knew that Marty's anger towards young people being harmed specifically was what would get him to work alongside him. The fact that they were both together at the end and that Rust saved Marty's life by killing Childress as he was on the floor losing blood and on the verge of death, it was the perfect way for the pair's relationship to hit a crescendo, showing the care that they had for one another, and that despite everything that they'd gone through together in life, they had each other's backs when it mattered most. A character profile. Rust was an individual that hated the world because he felt the world hated him. The death of his daughter was the very reason as to why we saw him acting the way that he was. Cold, bitter, like he felt nothing, and just to the point where he never wasted a breath. Yet this was also the reason as to why he was determined, passionate, ruthless, and like a dog with a bone. He didn't want to give up with what he was doing, and he wanted to make sure that justice was served and that corruption was stopped. It's hard to say whether or not there was a connection in his mind over the death of these young women and the fact that he had a daughter that was killed in an accident. A somewhat paternal instinct that could have been there, and maybe empathy for the families because he knew what it was like to lose a child. That could be the case, but it felt like it could have just been something which supported this quote that he said, "The world needs bad men. We keep other bad men from the door." He could have simply just been doing his job, and because it was incomplete, he wanted to make sure that they were caught, stopped, and that no other people would be harmed. As every killing that took place, he almost felt the weight of it on his shoulders for not catching them. The fact that once he pulled through from his injuries and woke up from his coma, he was disappointed that he only got Childress, and that there were still more people in the video of the cult that were out there and were never caught is telling of the type of person that Rust actually is. He cares about what he does, the safety of people, and the stopping of bad people that are out there. A case plagued his mind from 95 to 2012. He caught the person who killed his victim, yet he was still not satisfied. In my opinion, this quote sums up why Rust was such a determined detective and was far superior than Marty when it came to being in the interrogation room and actually solving crimes. Rust once said, "Life's barely long enough to get good at one thing, so be careful what you get good at." Rust got good at being a detective, being obsessive and seeking justice, and despite coming across as a cold, ruthless, obsessive, emotionally inept human being, He's actually the opposite, yet his shell just tells a different story. He wears his scars, but he also uses them as a way of being good at what he does. It's clear to see that he doesn't let people in, but Marty was that small exception, and the pairing of the both of them was the very thing that saved his life in more ways than one. So, there you have it, the curious case of Rust Cohle.